Okay, this is podcast number 1 for Standard 5.1. In this standard, we're going to be looking at the process of evolution, and specifically in this podcast, we're going to be looking at natural selection. So within Standard 5.1, we're going to describe natural selection and give some examples where natural selection has happened. We're going to identify why there is a struggle for existence among members of a species, and then how that can lead to natural selection and survival of the fittest. And in the second podcast, we're going to take a look at the various forms of evidence that support the theory of evolution. Okay, so we're going to start with just talking about what evolution is. Evolution, when we say this word, what we're talking about is a change in a species that happens over a very long period of time. So you cannot talk about an individual evolving. It is the change of an entire species of living things, and it happens over a very long period of time. Typically, we're talking about thousands of years, millions of years. That's how long the evolutionary process takes. So basically, what the theory of evolution states is that modern organisms have descended from ancient organisms. So all the organisms that exist now on Earth are descendants of organisms that no longer exist. A lot of people think of evolution as this type of picture where fish grew legs, became lizards, and lizards evolved into monkeys, and monkeys evolved into men. And then it's just kind of funny because it's saying, we're getting kind of lazy. This is not a true vision of evolution, something to keep in mind. If we had evolved directly from monkeys, then those monkeys would no longer exist. And so we're going to take a look at why that is when we talk about evolution. So even though I have this picture up here, this is not what your vision of evolution is supposed to be. It's a little bit different than this. All right, the whole process and thoughts about evolution started with a scientist named Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin was a naturalist who lived in England, and in 1831, and he was pretty young, he was only in his 20s, he took a voyage around the world on a ship called the HMS Beagle. And on this ship, this was a trading ship, so the ship made a lot of stops around the world, and one of the important stops that it made in terms of what Charles Darwin did was at a set of islands off the coast of Ecuador called the Galapagos Islands. During his entire voyage, and especially on the Galapagos Islands, he collected lots of living specimens, and he also started to find lots and lots of fossils during his trip. And what he noticed as he went around is that there was a large amount of diversity among species all over the world. He grew up in England where there were certain types of animals that were found in that area. And as he traveled the world, he noticed there was lots of different kinds of things living in all different kinds of climates all over the world. And what he did is after this voyage, and it took him a really long time to do this, he wrote a book called On the Origin of Species. And in this, he describes his theory of evolution by a process that he called natural selection. And if you think about the word natural selection, it means nature is selecting for certain traits. And so that's what we're going to be going over in this part of this unit. So if we take a look at Darwin's voyage, he started up here at the British Isles and went down, and he went all the way around South America, and he made lots and lots of stops all around. Here are the Galapagos Islands. And then he came all the way around, stopped in Australia, stopped in some islands in the Indian Ocean, stopped in the Cape of Good Hope down in Africa, and then made his way back. So this voyage, which took about 5 years to take, he really stopped and saw a lot of different places on Earth as he went around. And he really did notice a lot of variation among living species. So as he was on this, he noticed that even though around different parts of the world there were different species, he also noticed that when you're looking at a single species, there's variation among individuals of that single species. So in this picture, we have a species of flowers, and you can see there's variation in their color, in their shape, in their size, but they're all the same species of flower. Those variations that he saw, we now know are genetic traits, and those different variations can be helpful to an individual or they could be harmful to an individual. And depending on what kind of trait you're looking at, whether it's helpful or harmful, that's going to determine whether or not you're going to start to see that trait more and more within the species. So what is evolution by natural selection? Well, because in the wild, living out, if you're talking about a species of living things living in a forest, let's say, there is a struggle for existence. Members of the same species are in constant competition for various things, including food, living space, and mates. They have to compete for these things all the time. So we can measure that competition in terms of fitness. Fitness is the ability of an individual to be able to survive and reproduce in its environment. So whoever is best at surviving and reproducing in their environment has the highest fitness. For example, we're going to talk about this again in a minute, a giraffe that has the longest neck is the one that's going to get the most food, and so they're therefore going to reproduce more. That means that they have high fitness. And if they have higher fitness than other giraffes, they're going to reproduce more. They're going to pass on the trait that gives them that higher fitness. That is what natural selection is about. Okay, so let's take a look at how did giraffes end up with this kind of long neck trait. Okay, so originally the necks of giraffes were not long. They actually had rather short necks. You know, kind of like a horse, maybe a little bit longer. Okay, but occasionally there were some giraffes that had necks that were a bit longer than average. Now, what happens with the giraffes is the ones with the slightly longer necks were able to get food from higher up. And when there was a change in the environment and the trees started to grow more leaves higher up and less down low, the giraffes with the longer necks had a survival advantage. They were able to reach those leaves. So they were able to reach the leaves, they got food, and they survived. The ones with the shorter necks couldn't get the food, and they died. So the ones that had the longer necks survived, they then reproduced, and they passed on that long neck trait. And now we have giraffes, all of which have long necks. And if a short neck one happens to be born, it may not survive because it's not going to get the food that it needs, and it will not pass on the short neck trait. So this is how evolution really happens. Whoever is best suited for their environment survives, passes on those traits. Eventually, everybody has the trait that makes them good at surviving. Another example of this that Darwin saw on the Galapagos Islands were the Galapagos tortoises. And these tortoises, there's a bunch of different ones. Here's a picture of 3 of them. They develop different body shapes based on available food. So depending on what kind of food source was available to them on their island, they developed a different kind of shell shape and neck length. So if you look at Isabella is a pretty short dome-shaped shell with a short neck, so their food source is probably down low. Whereas an individual who was on Hood Island, their food source must be higher up, so they have to be able to have a longer neck so they can reach that higher food. So if you were to take the Isabella Island and put them onto the Hood Island tortoise, if you took the Isabella tortoise and put them on the Hood Island, they probably would not survive because they wouldn't be able to get the food. Whereas these guys over here would be able to get the food. Okay, so depending on what kind of food was available over many, many, many generations, they found a way to survive because the ones that had the best trait available survived and passed on that trait. So what is this trait that we're talking about? This is called an adaptation. So an adaptation is an inherited characteristic that increases an organism's fitness. Remember, fitness is the chance of survival and therefore reproducing. So anytime that there is a trait that increases fitness and it can be inherited, then it is an adaptation. Adaptations typically are caused by mutations that will help an individual to survive. So we've talked about how mutations can happen, and a lot of people think mutations are bad, but a lot of times they're good. Something good can come out of the mutation because it makes members of the species better able to survive in their environment, and then they pass on that trait until that mutation becomes normal. We talked about lactose intolerance was actually a mutation. The ability to break down milk was not something that humans were always able to do, but we needed to become able to do it in order to survive. So those people that were able to break down milk survived and passed on the trait, and those that were unable to were not surviving as well, and they're not passing on that trait as much. The trait still exists, but more people are able to break down milk now than not. So all of this comes down to something called survival of the fittest. So individuals that have high fitness, those that are best suited for their environment, are going to have a better chance of surviving and reproducing. And that just makes sense. If you can get the food, you can survive, and therefore if you can survive, you can reproduce. Okay? So this little comic just says, what's the most important thing in life, Dad? Is it love, happiness? Is it helping others? And it says, listen, son, most important thing in life is to find others who are in trouble and need your help. Why is that, Dad? Because they're the ones you eat. Right? So the weaker ones are the ones that are going to get eaten. They're not going to survive. They're not going to get the food. They're not going to pass on those traits that are making them weak. All right, so as a whole, how we would say natural selection. Only the members of a population that have the best traits, we call that high fitness, are going to reproduce and pass on those traits. What will happen is this is going to result in higher fitness for the entire species. And once the entire species has reached this high fitness level, very often that means they are now evolved into a new species, because they now have the newer traits that are going to make them better fit for their environment. And so the members of that species that had the older traits that were not as good are no longer going to exist. Now this whole process takes many, many generations to see. And we will go over an example later about how natural selection can actually happen very quickly. But usually we'll see this over hundreds of generations before we see the full effects of a completely new species forming. So if you think about it, if you have members of the species that have high fitness and there's members that have low fitness, the high fitness members are not going to want to reproduce with the low fitness ones. And so eventually they are selected against until they are no longer a part of the population. All right. The last couple of things we're going to talk about in this podcast is, number one, is descent with modification. And this is the idea that species that exist today have descended with changes from ancestor species. Okay, so if you can think about the horse, this is actually, there's a pretty complete fossil record of the horse. And if you go back to the ancient ancestor of the horse, you've got this kind of smaller version of the horse. They had actually 3 toes instead of 1 single hoof. And over time they have modified and gotten a little bigger, and their hooves have changed until you get to your modern horse. Now, once you're at your modern horse, the species that came before no longer exists. It goes away because this species is now better than this one. So this one can't survive as well, and eventually it will be gone. That's how evolution works. You can actually see this in your everyday life with vehicles. Cars go through descent with modification. Each year or two, they send out a new version of the car, and it's supposed to be a better version. So the 1953 Corvette descended with modifications into the 1963 Corvette. And this one's showing you that every 10 years the difference, but most car manufacturers now make these changes every year, and they will add things and make the car a little bit better. That's descent with modification. The previous car's stuff is still there, but they've improved it in some way. Okay, so all of this leads to the fact that common descent is kind of where it all comes from. So if you look at all the different species that exist on Earth, all the living different things, the idea of common descent is that all species have, over very, very long periods of time, we're talking billions of years, billions, but they have all descended from a common ancestor. And the more alike we are, the closer our common ancestor is. So if you look at, here's a lemur and a human, we have a common ancestor together that's closer than, say, a human and a fish. Our common ancestor there is a little more distant, a little more far away. So the more you have in common with something, and we can look at that in terms of DNA as well, the more the closer your last common ancestor was. So you can see that with humans. Humans share a very close common ancestor with chimpanzees. And then they also share common ancestors from further back in time with all animals. But our closest living relative is the chimpanzee. We did not evolve from the chimpanzee, because if we did, there would be no chimpanzees. but we do have a common ancestor. So the idea is that back here there was a common ancestor between chimps and humans. And humans went this way, and we went and maybe we started to live on the ground and live in caves. Whereas the chimps stayed up in the trees and they went and lived in this direction. But here was our common ancestor. We just went into different pathways and evolved into two separate species. But we started out as the same species way back when. This species, this common ancestor, is gone. It evolved into two separate species. That is how descent with modification and natural selection works.